tonight and being here. We are very excited with tonight's presentation by Dr. Dave Pruett. And he is Professor Emeritus of Mathematics at James Madison University. He, in addition to 3 decades of mathematics teaching at various levels, he's worked for a decade in NASA-related aerospace research. Dave is married to Suzanne Friedelein, interim director of James Madison University's Center for International Stabilization and Recovery, which is involved in landmine remediation around the world. Important work. They have 1 daughter, Elena, a millennial, and reside in Harrisonburg, Virginia, in the historic and scenic Shenandoah Valley. And you are here at the Caritas Consciousness Project, and I want you to just sit back and relax and listen to this inspiring presentation. I should just mention that Dave is also the author of a wonderful book called Reason and Wonder, which is the outgrowth of an award-winning IMU honors seminar that explores the nexus of science and spirituality. And I've asked him to show the cover of that book at some point also. So there's a couple more people joining. Just admit them. Okay. So Dave, please take the mic and let us hear your presentation.
All right, everyone. Can you see the screen okay?
I can. Yes,
Great.
there's thumbs up.
Welcome, everyone, to this Caritas lecture entitled At the Dawn of the Third Copernican Revolution. Was happy to see one friend other than Gloria out in the audience, Jim Craig, who's another Virginian. I've recently learned that the mission of the Caritas Consciousness Project is a noble one, to foster the evolution of human consciousness. I think most of us, if we're honest with ourselves, are painfully aware that humanity is in a tight race between enlightenment and planetary catastrophe. It's not at all clear which is going to prevail. Nevertheless, regardless of outcome, I think it's vitally important that each of us plays their unique part in the unfolding drama. I'm grateful for the work of Caritas and delighted to speak to you tonight. I am also well aware that most of you don't know me from Adam, so if you'll forgive me, I'm going to spend some time this evening telling a bit of my story, primarily because it intersects and is relevant to the larger story. But first, let's set the stage for this larger story, which some call big history. Sigmund Freud once wrote that Darwinism was the biological blow to human narcissism. It would appear then that one way our consciousness is evolving is in the recognition that we humans are not quite so special as we thought we were. This is both disheartening on the one hand and a great opportunity on the other, and we'll deal with both aspects in tonight's talk. Now, for those of us engaged in facilitating the evolution of human consciousness, it's helpful to place that evolution in historical context. Freud's statement, if you unpack it, gives us just that framework that we need. So in these 10 words, Freud encapsulated 5 centuries of Western intellectual history. His terse summary refers obliquely to the Copernican Revolution of 1543. It then credits Darwin's theory of evolution with launching a second Copernican revolution. And thirdly, it shrewdly sets the stage for Freud's claim to a third Copernican revolution, which was his intent all along. Now, originating in scientific discovery, Copernican revolutions profoundly alter human self-perceptions. They are so named in deference to Nicholas Copernicus, the Polish astronomer, mathematician, and cleric, who by shifting our cosmology from geocentric to heliocentric, literally made the Earth move. It was in reference to this scientific earthquake that Thomas Kuhn, the renowned historian of science, coined the term paradigm shift. Now, while the Copernican revolution was mid-stride, the publication in 1859 of Darwin's Origin of Species rocked Victorian England, sending another shockwave around the world. 160 years after Darwin, humanity still hasn't made peace with origin, as attested to by continuing controversies over the teaching of evolution in public schools, genetic engineering, and intelligent design. A thesis of tonight's talk is that humanity is now embarking upon a third Copernican revolution. Whereas the first two were largely initiated by individuals, the third is undeniably a collective effort in which you and I are deeply involved simply by our presence in this group tonight. Now, one way to put these successive but overlapping revolutions into context is by considering the principal metaphysical question addressed by each. The first Copernican revolution asked the big question: what is the place of humans in the physical cosmos? The second revolution then followed by asking about our place in the biological cosmos. And our premise tonight is that we are just now at the dawn of a third Copernican revolution, which seeks to understand the place of the human in the spiritual or psychic cosmos. Now, here's what we'd like to accomplish this evening. First, to provide an introduction to the topic, and that's already done. Then for me to provide some relevant personal history. And then we'll walk through one by one the three Copernican revolutions just described, spending most of our time on the third, whose outcome is more speculative because it is very much in its early stages. And hopefully we'll have time for some lively discussion. Now, for me, this all gets personal. I don't usually share my history in the courses I teach because I'm not sure that it's useful or appropriate. But in this case, I'm going to make an exception because I think it's relevant. So first, as Gloria said, I'm a retired academic applied mathematician. So you might be wondering why someone who's admittedly a nerd would have a deep and abiding interest in spirituality and human consciousness. So let me give you the broad outlines. Here's a cherished photo of mom and dad. Both are now deceased, mom in 2011, dad in 2014. Dad was a World War II vet who went to med school on the GI Bill to become a small town general practitioner. Mom was a homemaker whose primary interests were her children, the Parent-Teacher Association, the DAR, and the Baptist Church. As a medical doctor, Dad was scientific and rational, not particularly religious, although he had an almost infallible moral compass. Mom, on the other hand, was intuitive and religious. She disbelieved in evolution, but believed in ESP. The dynamics in our family were such that I felt torn between these competing poles, the rational on the one hand and the intuitive on the other. At an emotional level, I felt I had to choose one over the other. So this made it hard for me to settle vocationally. So to put it mildly, I'm a very late bloomer. To make that long story short, I completed my PhD at 38, married at 39, and became a first-time father at 47, the age at which I finally settled at James Madison University. Along the way, I once considered the ministry. I taught mathematics at the high school level and at 2 other Virginia universities. And as Gloria mentioned, I accumulated a decade of experience in the aerospace industry in 3 separate stints at NASA's Langley Research Center. Despite this convoluted and sometimes painful career path, I had some help along the way. And with the hindsight that nearly a full life provides, I see the hand of Providence guiding what seemed at the time like a wandering in the wilderness. In midlife, at the age of 38, I encountered this gentleman, whom some of you might know. Unbeknownst to me at the time, his positive impact on my life would be immeasurable. It was October 1986, halfway through my first semester teaching at Virginia Commonwealth University. I stumbled upon an announcement, a flyer posted by Jungian Ventures for a talk on the life of C.G. Jung, the iconoclastic Swiss psychiatrist who was a protege of Freud, but who broke with Freud on the nature of the subconscious. The talk on a Thursday evening was by John Youngblood, with whom I was completely unfamiliar. For reasons I still can't fathom, I went to this talk, something I almost never did during the week because my first semester was so incredibly stressful. Now, at the time, John was exactly the age I am now, and he was in the early stages of Parkinson's disease. He apologized in advance for his labored speech and then proceeded to deliver a slow but riveting lecture that focused on Jung's successful struggle to break the bonds of his inherited spirituality and to forge a more expansive spirituality. But it was not so much the lecture I remembered as my impression of the speaker. I kept repeating to myself, I have been in the presence of a truly genuine human being. I can't recall having that impression so strongly before or since. I did not meet John at that time, but a seed had been planted. 14 months later, I learned that he would lead a weekend-long Advent retreat at the Episcopal Diocese Center on the outskirts of Richmond, and I signed up immediately. There were perhaps 25 to 30 rapt attendees. During the weekend, John wove 3 strands together into an unbreakable cord. First, conventional New Testament Christianity with its dual emphases on forgiveness and love. Second, the unconventional depth psychology of Carl G. Jung. And third, the unconventional science and cosmogenesis and complexity consciousness of the French scientist and priest Teilhard de Chardin. I was hooked. And at the end of the retreat, I asked John if we could somehow stay in touch. And thus it was that he became my mentor for the remaining 8 years of his life. Thereafter, we wrote perhaps once a month or every 6 weeks, and once or twice a year, I'd journey to Leesburg, Virginia for a personal retreat with John. Now, he seldom spoke of his own history unless asked, but over the years, I asked enough questions to flesh it out. I found out that he grew up in the bluegrass and horse country of Kentucky, went to Harvard Divinity School, and became an Episcopalian priest. He was much beloved and apparently a dynamic speaker in his heyday. But at the age of 44, John was beset by a recurring dream that his priestly vestments had become a straitjacket. I once quipped to John, who had a wonderful sense of humor, John, even I can interpret that dream. Well, needless to say, John eventually left the formal ministry, became a Quaker, participated in the civil rights movement, and became personal friends with Martin Luther King Jr. From the middle to the end of his life, John never again held what most would consider a bona fide job. Instead, he wrote books, gave lectures for which he was much in demand, led individual and group retreats, and counseled clients. What precipitated John's leaving the formal ministry was disillusionment with Christianity. He recognized, largely through Teilhard, that all living beings, including religious traditions, must grow or die. In particular, Christianity needed to expand to embrace new revelations, both from depth psychology and from modern science. One of John's books was titled Shaping a Personal Myth to Live By, the outgrowth of his own struggle to develop a satisfying personal mythology. Another of his books was The Gentle Art of Spiritual Guidance. Now, when I say John was a counselor, that doesn't quite get at it. He was, of course, trained in pastoral counseling, but what he did was not analogous to what most psychologists or analysts do. John took to heart the counsel of Joseph Campbell to follow your bliss. So he gently probed each client to find that individual's unique bliss. And then, like a good father, John blessed that gift, that bliss, and called it to the forefront. His job, as he saw it, was to help counselees get on thread. That is, to uncover and walk their unique path in life. During most of the time I knew John, I worked at NASA, but I chafed to return to the classroom. And through John's encouragement of my bliss, I began to have a wild idea for an honors course, should I ever get back into academia. The title came before the course did. It was From Black Elk to Black Holes, Shaping a Myth for a New Millennium. You can see John's influence in the subtitle, Shaping a Myth. You see, I had begun to suspect that my personal struggle to integrate reason and intuition, that is, to unify head and heart, was really universal at some level and reflected in our societal struggle to integrate science and religion. In spring 1999, my pipe dream became a reality at James Madison University. The course was launched as Honors 200D with 21 eager students. The course's premise was to look at the universe from diametrically opposed perspectives, from a mythological perspective on one hand and a scientific one on the other, and then to seek resonance between the two. The mythological perspective came from Native American mythology, as described in the American classic Black Elk Speaks, which chronicles the life and times of the Lakota shaman Nicholas Black Elk. The scientific perspective came from the revelations of modern physics, including relativity and quantum theory. Our Holy Grail? Well, could we possibly create a new story that is faithful both to modern scientific revelations and to ancient spiritual wisdom? Despite my trepidation at the beginning, the course succeeded beyond my wildest hopes. And at the end of the semester, I received my favorite course evaluation of all time. It said simply, is it appropriate to write on a course evaluation that this course changed my life? It did. And there were many similar evaluations. And to this day, I remain in contact with quite a few of the students from these courses. On day one of the course, I naively confessed to the students, I think I have a book in me, and I think that teaching this course will help me to write it. Well, it was naive because 13 years passed before Reason and Wonder was published in 2012. But the confession had a happy consequence. Students realized that this was a different kind of course. We'd be making a journey together, and the destination was not preordained. So I got immediate buy-in. Eventually, Honors 200D was offered 7 times, received a Science Religion Course Award from the Templeton Foundation, and led to my being JMU's first recipient of the Provost Award for Honors Teaching. Now, to bring this long tangent to a conclusion, here's what I'm really trying to convey. The 2 most important or meaningful things I have accomplished in my professional life have nothing to do with NASA or papers on computational fluid mechanics, which was my field. They are the honors course, Black Elk to Black Holes, and the book, Reason and Wonder, which was a spin-off of the honors course. My time with John and my honors teaching experiences have driven home how desperately we Western humans need a new mythology, one faithful both to head knowledge and to heart wisdom. And it was glorious serendipitous discovery of my book that led to tonight's presentation. Now, with that somewhat long personal history, let's turn to our main topic, starting with the original Copernican revolution. Cosmology was a survival skill for our forebears. Hunter-gatherers studied the heavens to anticipate migrations. So did cultivators whose harvest depended upon planting at the optimal time of the year. And those who traveled the seas did so at great peril, greater unless they could predict the tides and navigate by the stars. There's nothing quite as enthralling as gazing into the night sky. The naked eye can distinguish 4,000 to 6,000 stars. In the sky, one finds both change and constancy. By day, the sun faithfully rises and sets as it has done for all of recorded history and long before that. By night, the moon waxes and wanes with dependability, and Polaris reliably points our way. Constellations change their positions, but not their patterns. An observer on planet Earth is not aware of their motion. The sun, moon, and stars, in contrast, do appear to move. So it was natural that early cosmological models would embody human experience. The two-sphere model, for example, incorporated a fixed Earth at the center of the cosmos and a celestial sphere concentric to the Earth containing all visible stars. The celestial sphere rotated on a daily cycle. The two-sphere model, however, did not account for the wanderers, that is, the planets, the sun, and the moon, which appear to wander through the field of fixed stars. The pre-Socratic Greek philosopher Parmenides accommodated the planets by including additional spheres, one for each wanderer. Now, geocentric, that is, Earth-centered cosmology, attained its zenith in the 2nd century of the Common Era, with the publication of Ptolemy's masterpiece, the Almagest, meaning the greatest. Science historian Thomas Kuhn summarizes the import of the Almagest thusly. It epitomized the greatest achievement of ancient astronomy, for it was the first systematic mathematical treatise to offer a complete, detailed, and quantitative account of all celestial motions. Ptolemy's model was so convincing that it reigned supreme for 14 centuries, an enormously long time for any scientific theory to survive relatively unscathed. Now, attributing to the model's longevity was that it fit hand in glove with the church's mythology. In the geocentric cosmology of Ptolemy, God's highest creation, the human, resides fittingly at the exact center of the cosmos. Moreover, there's a special place for God just outside the celestial sphere. It was a cozy little universe with a place for everything. So Ptolemaic cosmology became de facto church dogma. Moreover, Aristotle taught that the heavens were immutable and existed in a state of perfection, and that the planets were perfect spheres. This too fit church mythology, and so it was echoed by Thomas Aquinas, the 13th century Dominican friar, considered one of Catholicism's greatest theologians. Aquinas wrote, and I'll give you just a moment to read this quotation. But every scientific theory must eventually face what is known as the damned facts. These are facts that refuse to fit the paradigm. Specifically, geocentric cosmology had difficulty explaining the following. First, extreme variations in planetary brightness. Second, extreme variations in the apparent size of the planets. Third, the phases of Venus, which goes through phases like our moon. And lastly, retrograde motion of some of the wanderers, the planets. Now, of these four recalcitrant facts, the most vexing was the so-called retrograde motion of some planets, particularly Mars, which during certain periods of the year appears to reverse direction, as indicated by the red dots in this slide. Well, enter Copernicus, born in the trading Mecca of Torun, Poland, in 1473. When Copernicus's father died in 1484, the family's care passed to a scholarly uncle, a bishop, who decreed that Copernicus would receive a world-class education so he could follow in the uncle's footsteps. Thus, Copernicus studied mathematics and astronomy at the University of Krakow, then Greek, law, and medicine at the prestigious Italian universities of Bologna, Ferrara, and Padua. At Bologna, he resided with a mathematics professor who criticized Ptolemaic cosmology and nurtured Copernicus's passion for astronomy. Copernicus, also a late bloomer, was nearly 40 years of age when he returned to Poland to accept a sinecure as canon at the Frauenburg Cathedral. There, on the roof, above the smoke of the city, he established an observatory and nightly mapped the heavens. And there he began his opus magnum on the revolutions of the heavenly spheres. Now, Copernicus understood a fundamental principle that would later form the basis of Einstein's theory of relativity, namely that uniform motion is relative. I sense that I am moving only in relation to something else that is fixed or moving differently. In particular, the apparent motions of the heavens are easier to explain by a heliocentric, that is, a sun-centered cosmology. In this model, the sun anchors our solar system and the planets revolve around the sun. The apparent motions of the sun and stars are artifacts of the Earth's daily rotation on its axis, and the apparent retrograde motion of some planets results from an optical illusion dependent on the relative positions of the planets within their orbits. As a cleric of the church, Copernicus realized he was skating close to heresy. First, the church embraced Ptolemy, Aristotle, and Aquinas. Second, biblical literalists pointed to scriptures that implied that the sun moved, not the earth. For example, in Joshua commands, "O sun, stand still at Gibeon." Now, Copernicus dodged the official wrath of the church by, well, conveniently dying. He saw the first copy of his book as he lay on his deathbed. So the promotion of heliocentric cosmology fell to others, principally Galileo, who was born in 1564. Galileo unabashedly promoted Copernican cosmology, which the church was not prepared to accept. Moreover, he perfected the telescope, which revealed unwelcome things about the heavens. Galileo first trained the telescope on our nearest celestial neighbor, the moon. He reported blemishes, craters, and chasms rather than Aristotelian perfection. By boosting the power of the telescope to 30, Galileo discovered 4 large moons of Jupiter, which he dubbed the Medicean stars. Clearly, not all heavenly bodies orbited the Earth, as Ptolemy had taught. These and other heresies earned Galileo a trip to the Inquisition in 1633. Were it not for his fame and the intervention of benefactors, he likely would have been executed. Broken, Galileo spent the remaining decade of his life under house arrest. The church officially apologized for its treatment of Galileo in 1992, on the occasion of the 350th anniversary of his death. So by this measure, humans needed nearly 4 centuries to process the shock of the Copernican Revolution. To understand the psychological significance of the new cosmology, one needs to know a bit of physics. Galileo's telescope revealed that the heavens actually have depth. The stars are not all located in a single spherical surface. One way to assess distance is by parallax. If the same object is seen from 2 different perspectives, and the distance between the 2 viewpoints is known, then the distance to the object, say a star, could in principle be computed by trigonometry. In geocentric cosmology, with the Earth fixed, the maximum distance between the 2 viewpoints is the diameter of the Earth, or about 8,000 miles. But in heliocentric cosmology, that distance is 180 million miles, the diameter of the Earth's orbit. So if the relative positions of stars appear to change very little, even when the viewpoints are separated by 180 million miles, then those stars must be unimaginably distant. So Copernicus exploded the cozy universe of Ptolemy. Now, Big Bang cosmology is a 20th century aftershock of Copernicanism. It originates in Einstein's general theory of relativity, released to the world in 1916. Now, general relativity is actually a generalized theory of gravitation that can be applied to massive objects like stars or collections of massive objects, even to the universe as a whole. And when one does that, one finds that the universe, in contravention of Aristotle, cannot be static. It must either expand or contract. Now, but Einstein himself did not believe this. So he fudged his own equations with a term he called the cosmological constant to hold the universe in static check. He later admitted this as the greatest mistake of his life. Now, meanwhile, in the early 1920s, Edwin Hubble sat night after night at the 100-inch telescope of the Mount Wilson Observatory in California. Hubble was trying to answer a vexing question that had plagued astronomers since the time of the philosopher Immanuel Kant. Kant, an amateur astronomer, had proposed that faint objects in the night sky, believed to be simple stars, were actually galaxies, which he called island universes, each like our own Milky Way. If Kant were right, the universe would be vast beyond comprehension. What Hubble discovered was doubly stunning. First, Kant was right. There are myriads of galaxies. But second, and completely unexpected, on average, these galaxies are receding from one another, which implies an expanding cosmos. Simultaneously, George Lemaitre, a Belgian Catholic priest and physicist, had used Einstein's equations to show that the universe must expand. He arranged for Einstein, the theorist, and Hubble, the astronomer, to meet for dinner to discuss the possibility of a non-static universe, with him as moderator. Eventually, the data convinced Einstein, who exclaimed that it was the most beautiful thing he had seen in his lifetime. So, what have we learned from Copernicus and the Big Bang? Well, we do not exist at the dead center of a cozy little universe of a few thousand stars. Rather, our Earth orbits an ordinary star on one arm of a spiral galaxy called the Milky Way. And there are 100 billion such Milky Ways, each with 100 billion stars on average. It is mind-boggling. Moreover, as Lemaitre suspected, this universe is expanding, which means that if you travel back in time, at some point, the entire universe must have existed at a singular point, which Lemaitre called the primeval atom. Today, we know that point in time as the Big Bang, estimated at 13.7 billion years ago. Of all discoveries and opinions, observed Goethe, none may have exerted a greater effect on the human spirit than the doctrine of Copernicus. And similarly, Einstein said that Copernicanism was probably the severest shock man's interpretation of the cosmos ever received. Well, welcome to the second of the three Copernican revolutions. This one is the biological revolution. Now, Charles Darwin is perhaps the most reviled scientist of all time, for his theory really upset the religious orthodoxy, namely of creation through divine fiat. I first met Darwin in 2003 when a colleague from JMU took a bunch of professors to London in hopes of ensnaring one of us to continue teaching his study abroad course when he retired. That course was titled British Foundations of Modern Science, and our first field trip was to the British National Portrait Gallery. Of all the incredible portraits in that gallery, this one most captured my attention. The striking likeness of Darwin by John Collier, painted less than 2 years before Darwin's death, is nearly life-size. The viewer stares directly into Darwin's unblinking, slightly downcast eyes, in whose depths are found all manner of qualities and emotions: intelligence, gentleness, sadness, wisdom, and world weariness. In those eyes, one feels the lingering grief that Darwin never quite shook in the loss of 3 children. In those eyes, one appreciates the gentleness that rendered Darwin incapable of defending himself, and one encounters a man grown weary of life's vicissitudes. With his dark traveling cape and flowing beard, Darwin seems more a biblical prophet than an iconoclastic scientist. I resolved then and there to get to know the man. Now, Charles Darwin was born into a prominent family in 1809 in Shrewsbury, England. His paternal grandfather, Erasmus Darwin, was a physician and free-thinking member of the Midlands Enlightenment. Erasmus is perhaps best known as the author of Zoonomia, which actually anticipated the theory of evolution but offered no explanation for it. And you can see that in this quotation when he asks, would it be too bold to imagine that all warm-blooded animals have arisen from one living filament? Charles's father, Robert Waring Darwin, was also a physician, and his mother, Susanna Wedgwood, was of the Wedgwood China dynasty. Charles was the 5th of 6 siblings that included 3 older sisters and an older brother. When he was just 8 years of age, Charles's mother died, and he was sent off to a boarding school where his brother attended. Charles Darwin early on showed no exceptional promise. Of him, his father lamented, "You care nothing for nothing but shooting, dogs, and rat catching, and you'll be a disgrace to yourself and your family." Now, friends, that's shooting dogs and not shooting dogs, I'm pretty sure. Now, Robert demanded that Charles, like his father and grandfather, become a physician, but Charles had no stomach for it. After attending medical school at the University of Edinburgh for a year and sickening at witnessing a surgery before the use of anesthetics, he left the study of medicine forever. He then matriculated at Cambridge University's Christ College. By his own account, he played the dandy while at Cambridge. In his words, "I got into the sporting set, including some dissipated, low-minded young men, more intent on having a good time than determined to pursue their academic studies." Well, this attitude is very familiar to any present-day professor of any subject at universities. And in a passage in which you can almost see Darwin's eyes twinkle, he recalled, "I know I ought to feel ashamed of the days and evenings thus spent, but as some of my friends were very pleasant, and we were all in the highest spirits, I cannot help looking back to these times with much pleasure." Charles Darwin, though, had one extraordinary gift: unmatched powers of observation. In the words of a physician who was a friend of the family, no object in nature, whether flower or bird or insect of any kind, could avoid his loving recognition. Now, Darwin's botany professor, John Stevens Henslow, was fond of taking students on field trips for collecting biological specimens. Darwin was such a regular on these trips, he became known across campus as the man who walks with Henslow. Such outings led to a new passion, beetle collecting. Seeing his name associated with a rare specimen in an illustrated volume elated him. He recalled, quote, no poet ever felt more delighted at seeing his first poem in print than I. In August 1831, Darwin learned of an opportunity to accompany a round-the-world scientific expedition aboard the HMS Beagle. Henslow was supposed to go, but his wife would have nothing to do with it. So Henslow tapped his star pupil. Charles was thrilled, that is, until his father nixed the idea. Fortunately, his uncle, Josiah Wedgwood, intervened on Charles's behalf. Darwin was then just 22 years of age, and like most of his era, he was a young earth creationist who accepted the biblical account of creation without question. Specifically, he believed the earth to be a mere 6,000 years old, a number calculated by counting the begats in the Bible and adding up the generations. The Beagle set sail on December 27, 1831, and returned on October 2nd, 1836, after a voyage of almost 5 years' duration. Throughout it all, Darwin kept a journal, which was published after his return as The Voyage of the Beagle. It is riveting reading. The journal begins with this poetic passage. After having been twice driven back by heavy southwestern gales, Her Majesty's ship Beagle, a 10-gun brig under the command of Captain Fitzroy, sailed from Devonport on the 27th of December, 1831. And on the 6th of January, we reached Tenerife, but were prevented landing by fears of our bringing the cholera. The next morning, we saw the sunrise behind the rugged outline of the Grand Canary Island, and suddenly illumine the peak of Tenerife, whilst the lower parts were veiled in fleecy clouds. This was the first of many delightful days never to be forgotten. Darwin was often seasick under sail, but traipsing about on land, he was in his element. As a parting gift, Henslow had given Darwin a copy of Charles Lyell's classic text, Principles of Geology. Lyell held the unorthodox view that the Earth's geology had been shaped primarily by the accumulation of gradual changes rather than by huge catastrophic events. This view, however, required accepting that the Earth is ancient. Henslow cautioned Darwin to ignore these blasphemous parts of Lyell's Principles of Geology. Before long, though, Darwin, self-educated by Lyell's book, evolved into a consummate geologist, and it was geology that led him to the theory of evolution. Evolution requires deep time in order to work its magic. Darwin first had to accept the antiquity of the Earth. And in reading Voyage of the Beagle, one can pinpoint precise moments when Darwin first entertained the notion of deep time. One of the first occurred near Concepcion, Chile, where Darwin experienced an earthquake firsthand. I happened to be on shore and was lying down in the wood to rest myself. It came on suddenly and lasted 2 minutes, but the time appeared much longer. There was no difficulty in standing upright, but the motion made me almost giddy. It was something like the movement of a vessel in a little cross ripple, or still more, like that felt by a person skating over thin ice which bends under the weight of his body. Following the quake, mussel shells that had been submerged now resided fully 3 feet above the waterline. So Darwin had an epiphany that similar shells on a ridge 1,200 feet above sea level were the result of countless such quakes over a very long time. The earthquake also became metaphor for Darwin, whose bedrock beliefs had been shaken. It all came to a head in the Galapagos in February 1835. The Galapagos Islands are relatively inhospitable. Consequently, there are only a few hardy, well-adapted species, primarily tortoises, lizards, and finches. The lack of diversity concentrated Darwin's attention. The finches were of particular interest. In all, Darwin counted 26 varieties of finch, nearly all identical, save for the size and structure of their beaks, which seemed perfectly adapted for cracking the dominant types of seeds on the particular islands the birds inhabited. It was here he began to entertain his dangerous idea. Quote, "Seeing this gradation and diversity of structure in one small, intimately related group of birds, one might really fancy that from an original paucity of birds in this archipelago, one species had been taken and modified for different ends." The dangerous idea, of course, was that species are not immutable. They evolve over time to adapt to changing conditions. Again, quote, "If there is the slightest foundation for these remarks, the zoology of the archipelagos will be worth examining, for such facts would undermine the stability of species." Another dangerous idea Darwin entertained was that of extinction. On the voyage, Darwin collected a trove of fossil remains, including the skull of a giant toxodon, an aquatic creature the size of an elephant. One such skull found its way into the hands of my students during visits to the British Natural History Museum in 2005 and 2011. A student wrote in her journal, quote, "It's hard to deny evolution when it is staring you in the face." By the end of the 5-year voyage, Darwin was weary and eager to return to England. The Beagle landed in Falmouth on October 2nd, 1836, and 2 days later, Darwin reunited with his family in Shrewsbury. The man who returned was not the same man. The final passages in the journal include the following. "Among the scenes which are deeply impressed on my mind, none exceed in sublimity the primeval forest undefaced by the hand of man, whether those of Brazil, where the powers of life are predominant, or those of Tierra del Fuego, where death and decay prevail. Both are temples filled with the very productions of the God of nature. No one can stand in these solitudes unmoved and not feel there is more in man than the mere breath of his body." Darwin had been changed both by what he had seen and by what he had pieced together, one fact at a time, over those 5 years. He returned to notoriety. He immediately set about to have the finches he'd collected classified by experts in ornithology, and sure enough, most were different species. He was elected secretary of the Royal Geological Society. He published Voyage of the Beagle to instant success, and he published a book on his theory of coral reefs, which he had developed during a stop in the Cocos Islands. In 1839, at the age of 30, he married his first cousin, Emma Wedgwood. The two moved to Upper Gower Street in London and soon started a family that would grow to 10 children. In 1840, Darwin fell ill with a mysterious illness that plagued him for the remainder of his life. The conventional wisdom is that it was partly due to the bite of a Vinchuca beetle collected during the voyage, and that it was also partly psychosomatic. Abnormally sensitive, Charles Darwin was, in the words of his wife, quote, "the most transparent man I ever saw," unquote. He had no innate ability to protect himself, and he was keenly aware that his theory, if published, would attract criticism and condemnation from many quarters. To escape the grit and grime of London, as well as the frenetic social scene, both of which exacerbated his symptoms, Charles and Emma moved to Down House in Kent, where he was shielded, quote, "from every avoidable nuisance." There at Down House, Charles and Emma would raise their 10 children, losing 3, including Charles's beloved 10-year-old daughter, Annie, a loss from which he never fully recovered. There he would work leisurely 6 hours a day, piecing together a mountain of evidence for evolution, one laborious fact at a time. There, rain or shine, he walked his beloved sandwalk thrice daily, lost in contemplation as Annie turned pirouettes in front of him. And there he performed biological experiments of all kinds, lovingly tending the plants in Down House's extensive gardens. There he completed a 230-page draft of his theory in 1844. And then Darwin did the unthinkable. He shelved his theory for 8 years to write a treatise on, of all things, barnacles. Upon completing the barnacle tome, he confessed, "I hate a barnacle as no man ever did before, not even a sailor on a slow sailing ship." Why the delay? Darwin had earlier confessed to his friend Joseph Hooker, director of the Royal Botanical Gardens at Kew, quote, "I am almost convinced, quite contrary to the opinion I started with, that species are not, it is like confessing a murder, immutable," end quote. No one alive was more troubled by Darwin's ideas than Darwin himself. Fate forced his hand in 1858 when a friendly rival, Alfred Russel Wallace, threatened to scoop him. "I never saw a more striking coincidence. If Wallace had my manuscript sketch written out in 1842, he could not have made a better short abstract." Darwin's first reaction was to give Wallace credit for the theory of evolution. Lyell and Hooker talked him out of it with a Solomonic proposal. Both men should give a joint lecture on evolutionary theory to the Royal Geological Society. That lecture made little splash, but it freed Darwin to publish Origin of Species, which was published in 1859. It sold out on the very first day and has never gone out of print since. Given Darwin's temperament, the promotion of his ideas fell to others, notably Thomas Henry Huxley, an educator who became known as Darwin's bulldog. The Huxley dynasty, by the way, includes Sir Julian Huxley, the famous evolutionary biologist, and Aldous Huxley, author of Brave New World and the Perennial Philosophy. Prior to the publication of The Descent of Man in 1871, Darwin lamented to Wallace, "I shall soon be viewed as the most despicable of men, the most odious and arrogant and odious beast that ever lived." But by then, Darwin's ideas had largely become more mainstream thanks to Huxley and others. So after Descent, Darwin's illness abated, and he turned attention to less controversial topics. His last work, believe it or not, was on earthworms. Now, the British have their faults, but the failure to recognize greatness is not one of them. Charles Robert Darwin lies buried in Westminster Abbey, close to his friend Charles Lyell, and both not far from Isaac Newton. Exactly 50 years later, in 2003, the human genome, which consists of 23 chromosomes and 30,000 genes, was completely decoded, ushering in the era of gene-based medicine. I'm sorry, I missed a slide. I'm going to back up here. In 1953, an aftershock of the Second Copernican Revolution rocked the world with the publication in the journal Nature of an article by Francis Crick and James Watson that described the structure of DNA. Now, this pair, along with Maurice Wilkins, received the Nobel Prize in 1962. Their discovery was partly based on exquisite X-ray photographs taken by Rosalind Franklin, who by 1962 had unfortunately died of ovarian cancer, most likely due to years of exposure to X-rays. But the double helix of DNA provided a mechanical explanation for cell mitosis that undergirded Darwin's theory. 50 years after the structure of DNA was illuminated, in 2003, the Human Genome Project was completed. The human genome consists of 23 chromosomes and 30,000 genes. And this new era has ushered in a new type of medicine, gene-based medicine. During a speech at JMU a decade ago, Francis Collins, who shepherded the Human Genome Project and is the current director of the National Institutes of Health, quipped, "Many things on your dinner plate have more genes than you do." So if there is a physical take-home message of a metaphysical take-home message of these first two Copernican revolutions, it is this. In the words of Teilhard de Chardin, creation has never stopped. The creative act is one continual gesture drawn out over the totality of time. The world is constantly emerging. When then was the moment of creation? Well, we could say it was at the Big Bang, but it was also yesterday, and it is today, and it will be tomorrow, and it is right now, at this very instant, in which a new world is being born, and you and I are part of that birthing process. An auxiliary message from the Second Copernican Revolution is that humans exist on the same tree of life as every other living organism, different in degree but not in kind. And the more we learn about the other creatures, the truer this recognition. Crows solve puzzles that require thinking ahead 8 steps. Elephants and whales mourn their dead. Bonobos can be musically creative at the keyboard. And should you ever fall into the trap of seeing yourself as vastly superior to any other creature, watch the Netflix documentary, my octopus teacher. This brings us at last to the Third Copernican Revolution, now in progress. Whereas individuals launched the first two, the third is very much a collective effort involving men and women the world over. We could start this story at many junctures, but a good starting point is the accidental joint discovery of radioactivity in 1895 by Wilhelm Röntgen in Germany and in 1896 by Henri Becquerel in France. Now that's just 125 years ago. Soon thereafter, in 1898, Marie Curie successfully isolated the radioactive elements polonium and radium. Curie eventually won 2 Nobel Prizes, the only person ever to receive Nobels in different areas. Now, the discovery of radioactivity undermined our conceptions of the material world in 2 radically different ways. First, at the atomic level, radioactive decay cannot be predicted, casting a cloud over the principle of causality. Radioactive atoms just seem to have minds of their own. Second, the particles emitted by decaying atoms could be used as little projectiles to probe the structure of matter. And what was found was completely unexpected and startling. Now, the idea that matter consists of elemental building blocks dates to Democritus in the 5th century before the Common Era. But atoms remained speculation until experiments with gases by the English chemist John Dalton in the early 18th century. These experiments yielded the first viable atomic theory. Now, too small to be seen to the naked eye, atoms were mysterious, and so it was natural to imagine them as very solid, like little billiard balls. The one to learn the surprising truth was Ernest Rutherford, who had received the Nobel in Chemistry in 1908 for his work in determining the half-lives of radioactive elements. Atypically, his most important work followed the Nobel. In 1909, he conducted experiments to probe the structure of gold foil using alpha particles, one of 2 types of particles that are shed during radioactive decay. Now, gold foil is dense, a dense heavy metal. Gold is a dense heavy metal. So it was presumed that the alpha particles would simply bounce off the foil. What Rutherford observed was unnerving. Most of the alpha particles passed through the gold foil completely unscathed. Only occasionally a particle would bounce off of something. Here's Rutherford's astonishing revelation in his own words. It was as incredible as if you fired a 15-inch shell at a piece of tissue paper and it came back and hit you. Rutherford drew the only conclusion he could. Atoms are mostly empty space with a tiny but dense nucleus. In fact, atoms are more than 99.9% empty. There are actually 2 revelations here about the nature of reality. The first is that matter is quantized. There are elemental building blocks that, though extraordinarily small, are nevertheless of finite size. The second is that the material world, the world of iron and rocks and gems, is mostly comprised of nothingness. This was expressed in almost poetic terms by 2 giants of physics in the 20th century, astronomer Arthur Eddington and the quantum physicist Erwin Schrödinger. In Eddington's words, the frank realization that the physical science is concerned with a world of shadows is one of the most significant of recent advances. Then he also refers to in Schrödinger's book, What is Life, he then refers to Eddington talking about Eddington's favorite writing desk. He says, some of you may remember Eddington's 2 writing desks, One is the familiar old piece of furniture at which he is seated, resting his arms on it. The other is the scientific physical body, which not only lacks all sensual qualities, but in addition is riddled with holes. By far the greatest part is empty space, just nothingness, interspersed with innumerable tiny specks of something, the electrons and nuclei whirling around. Now, Rutherford's experiments led him to model the atom as a tiny solar system with a dense nucleus where the sun would be and a bunch of electrons whirling around in orbits like planets. Rutherford's model is conceptually appealing because of the symmetry of inner and outer space, but Rutherford's model did not last long because it would have been unstable, so it was replaced by Niels Bohr's model, which incorporates the concept of the quantum, and there is where physics went down the rabbit hole. Bohr's model presupposed that the electron orbitals in an atom are quantized. So unlike, say, a satellite in Earth orbit, which can be in low Earth orbit or high Earth orbit or anywhere in between, electrons can only exist in discrete orbits and nowhere in between. Now, Bohr's admittedly strange atomic model immediately explained the mysterious lines in the so-called Fraunhofer spectra of light emitted by different chemical elements. Electrons that jump from one orbital to another emit a photon of light of a particular color when they do. And it's this phenomenon that allows us to deduce the chemical makeup of a star that is millions of light years distant. Now, Bohr had borrowed from the German physicist Max Planck, who won the Nobel Prize in 1918, for using the strange notion of the quantum to explain the so-called ultraviolet catastrophe that plagued physicists. In truth, at the beginning of the 20th century, physicists were plagued by three conundrums, each of which was resolved by the idea of the quantum. The most fundamental concerned the nature of light. Is light wave or particle? Well, physicists study both, waves and particles, but these are altogether different concepts. Think of a particle as a tiny marble. It's localized in space, and no two marbles can occupy the same place at the same time. In contrast, waves, think sound or water waves, are distributed in space, and two waves can interact. When two waves meet, their crests can align, which is known as constructive interference, or the trough of one can meet the crest of another, and what is known as destructive interference. And the latter is the principle of noise-canceling headphones, which is light, wave, or particle. In the 1600s, Isaac Newton did experiments with light and constructed a convincing corpuscular theory. The line, corpuscle being a particle. The lion had spoken, case closed. Not so fast. In 1801, Thomas Young conducted experiments to show that two interacting beams of light can produce interference patterns suggesting wave behavior. Well, enter Einstein into the fray in 1905. This was his miracle year, in which he produced his dissertation and 4 groundbreaking papers, any one of which could have earned him a Nobel Prize. The first paper explained the photoelectric effect, the second Brownian motion, the third gave us special relativity, and the fourth E = mc squared. This latter discovery was a postscript to relativity theory, and it's expressed as the most famous equation in the world. It implies that matter can be converted into energy and vice versa. Energy is liberated matter, matter is congealed energy. Like water and steam, they are two states of the same thing. One could just as correctly say that the universe is constructed of energy as to say it is constructed of matter, which is mostly nothingness anyway. Now, surprisingly, Einstein did not receive the Nobel Prize for the theory of relativity, but for explaining the photoelectric effect. To do so, he also borrowed Max Planck's idea. Einstein's explanation followed a change of logic. First, light behaves as a stream of particles. Like matter, light is quantized. There is a particle of smallest size, which he termed a photon. The energy contained in a photon depends on its frequency, perceived by humans as color. Now, at first blush, it would seem that Einstein had settled the question for good. But if you were paying close attention, you might notice that he muddied the water. The energy of a photon depends on its color or frequency. But frequency is a property of traveling waves. Oh goodness, the plot has thickened. Now, the new quantum theory resolved several conundrums, but it was also perplexing. The electrons in Bohr's atoms seemed to spontaneously jump from one orbital to another, emitting a photon when they did. But the apparent spontaneity, like that of radioactive decay, was maddening, groused Aaron Schrodinger. If we're going to have to put up with these damn quantum jumps, I'm sorry I ever had anything to do with the theory. More damn facts. And worse, where is the electron in the midst of the jump? Well, it's nowhere, because it cannot exist between the orbitals. Einstein was even more caustic about the new quantum theory. I find the idea quite intolerable that an electron exposed to radiation could choose of its own free will, not only the moment to jump, but also its direction. In that case, I'd rather be a cobbler or even an employee in a gaming house than a physicist. Now, Einstein didn't really believe that an electron has free will. He was being melodramatic. But what if the electron does indeed have free will? That would completely upset our apple cart. A strict determinist, Einstein was deeply troubled by the indeterminacy at the heart of quantum mechanics. He set out to disprove quantum theory, which led to a running debate with Bohr that lasted for nearly 2 decades. And in the most famous exchange of the debate, Einstein quipped, "God does not play dice," to which Bohr gave the fitting rejoinder, "Albert, stop telling God what to do." Now, Einstein's explanation of the photoelectric effect opened up Pandora's box. Which is light, wave, or particle? Well, it's still not clear. Scientists devised diabolically clever experiments to answer the question definitively. Time doesn't permit us to talk about these double-slit experiments. But what they revealed was even more startling than Rutherford's observations about the structure of the atom. Does light behave as wave or particle? Yes. Sometimes it behaves as a wave, sometimes as a particle. Which behavior it manifests depends on the experiment, but you can never observe it behaving as both wave and particle simultaneously. So light has an irreducible dual nature. Physicists dub this dualism wave-particle complementarity. But light is a form of energy, electromagnetic energy in particular. But Einstein had shown that matter and energy are equivalent, just different manifestations of the same thing. This suggests that one could replace the word light above with the word matter. So scientists performed these double-slit experiments again, this time not with light, but with electrons. And the results were the same. Matter can sometimes manifest as a wave and sometimes as a stream of particles. For this discovery of the wave-like nature of matter, the French nobleman Louis de Broglie received the Nobel in 1929. The quantum world, the world of the very small, does not behave at all like the macroscopic world of common experience. Physicists had neither language nor experience to describe the results of the experiments. A major step towards elucidating quantum phenomena was Heisenberg's statement of the uncertainty principle in 1927, for which he won a Nobel in 1932. In his words, the more precisely the velocity, the position of a particle is determined, the less precisely its velocity can be known, and vice versa. Now, this principle had philosophical as well as physical implications. Here again is Heisenberg in his own words. The very act of observing alters the thing being observed when the quantum numbers are small. The uncertainty principle collapses what had been termed the Cartesian partition between mind and matter. It had been assumed that the sentient observer could watch the observed, light beam or whatever, without influencing the result. In contrast, what the observer does affects the thing being observed. Observer and observed are not independent. Psyche or consciousness sneaks into physics through the back door of quantum mechanics. Well, the deeper that physicists dove into the implications of quantum theory, the more baffled they became. To get an idea of the angst engendered by quantum mechanics, consider this statement by Heisenberg, and I'll give you a moment to read that. To fully appreciate Heisenberg's angst, it may help to know that he was pressured into using the term uncertainty principle by Bohr, who was Heisenberg's mentor during his postdoc in Copenhagen. The German term Heisenberg originally picked meant something more akin to indeterminacy principle. Now, to most of us, it's a wash, but to the philosophically trained, and both Bohr and Heisenberg were, the terms convey something altogether different. Specifically, uncertainty implies something about philosophical epistemology. That's the study of how we know what we know or how we justify our knowledge. Uncertainty suggests that we cannot know simultaneously the location and velocity of a quantum object simply because we don't have a good enough measuring device. But indeterminacy implies something about philosophical ontology, about the underlying nature of reality itself. We cannot know simultaneously the position and velocity of the particle because they are not predetermined. That is, the underlying reality is not yet fully formed until the measurement is made. Well, as it turns out, it appears that Heisenberg's original term is the more accurate. This new understanding was codified by Bohr as the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, which states that physical systems generally do not have definite properties prior to being measured, and quantum mechanics can only predict the probabilities that measurements will produce certain results. The act of measurement affects the system, causing the set of probabilities to reduce to only one of the possible values immediately after the measurement. This is known as collapse of the wave function. To summarize then what the 20th century has taught us about matter, the presumed substance of the physical world. First, matter is mostly nothingness, empty space. Second, matter is congealed energy. Third, matter can manifest as wave or particle. Fourth, the wave nature expresses a tendency or probability to exist when observed. And finally, until the observation is made, what we call reality exists only as a spectrum of possibilities. Wow. Now, following Newton's laws of mechanics, the universe had begun to seem like a majestic clockwork with predictable motions. But after Einstein and quantum mechanics, it began to look very different. In the words of Sir James Jeans, the eminent British thermodynamicist and astronomer, the stream of knowledge is heading toward a non-mechanical reality. The universe begins to look more like a great thought than a great machine. This gets to the very heart of a philosophical debate that has simmered for centuries. Which came first, chicken or egg? Or more precisely, matter or spirit? Or we could say matter or psyche. Most scientists are materialists who hold that matter is primary and that life and consciousness are epiphenomena of material complexity. Most religious people believe that spirit came first. God said, "Let there be," fill in the blank. There is a third way, however. What if matter and spirit or consciousness are co-primary? In the words of quantum physicist Wolfgang Pauli, it would be most satisfactory of all if physics and psyche could be seen as complementary aspects of the same reality. Indeed, this third way was embraced also by Teilhard de Chardin, who was mentioned earlier, and who had a foot in both the scientific and religious worlds. Teilhard concluded, "There is neither spirit nor matter in the world. The stuff of the universe is spirit matter. No other substance but this could produce the human molecule." With this paradigm shift, things began to make sense that had not made sense before, much like the effect of Copernicus's shift of perspective. First, if consciousness is primary or co-primary with matter, then the appearance of consciousness ceases to be a chance, strange, and aberrant and fortuitous occurrence in the universe. And second, everything may be conscious at some level. Why not say this? Absolute, inert, and totally brute matter does not exist. Every element contains, at least in infinitesimal degree, some germ of inwardness and spontaneity, that is, of consciousness. So yes, even a quantum particle, like Einstein's leaping electron, may have a quantum of consciousness. Higher consciousness is associated with more complex forms of life, and presumably humans with the ability of self-reflection have the highest level of consciousness on this planet at this time. But everything in the material universe may have some level of interiority. Put another way, every material object, like a coin, has two faces, an inner face and an outer face. In Teilhard's words, coextensive with the without, there is a within to things. We have recognized the existence of a conscious inner face that everywhere duplicates the material external face, which alone is commonly considered by science. To summarize, for thousands of years, many humans have derived meaning from religious mythology that goes something like this. We were created by divine fiat in the image of God and are thus superior to the other creatures. We occupy the central point, Earth, of a cozy little universe consisting of a few planets and a few thousand stars. And Earth is our resource over which we have dominion. Modern science has exploded this mythology. We have given up both our special place in the cosmos and our special place on the tree of life. But I believe science's new revelations have given us more than they have taken from us. As far as we know, we are the only creatures on Earth, at least, cognizant of our own origin story, of our big history, all the way back to the bang. And what a magnificent story it is. In the words of Sir Julian Huxley, the human is nothing but evolution become conscious of itself. But we have also learned that the universe is not static, that creation is ongoing. This gives us the opportunity and sacred obligation to participate in the unfolding of creation. In the words of Teilhard, the true summons of the cosmos is a call consciously to share in the great work that goes on within it. And lastly, it appears that the Third Copernican Revolution may confirm what the spiritually awake have known for millennia, that you and I are never alone. Separation is illusion. We belong to a vast, diverse, and interconnected family that includes all fellow creatures of sky, earth, and sea, all flowers, plants, and trees, all rocks and mountains and streams, all planets, moons, and stars. In the words of the late cultural historian Thomas Berry, the universe is a communion of subjects, not a collection of objects. Or in the words of Black Elk, Mita koye o yasint, which translates, all my relatives, I am related to all things. Thank you, my new friends, and my apologies for running so long.
Well, thank you. It was wonderful, wonderful, beautiful lecture. Does anyone have any questions? And let me see if I can unmute. Actually, you might be able to unmute yourselves if you have a question.
I have lots of questions.
Okay.
Let me say first of all that let's call this discussion.
Okay.
I'm no guru, and I'm sure there are many questions I cannot answer. But go ahead. 554-887.
Oh gosh, I hate that. Let me put a name in there. Where's rename? I am Lee.
Hey, Lee.
Hi, Dave. Thank you so much. Just such a wonderful gift you've given us to share your learnings. Thank you so much. And just a to talk about creation and how we're part of it, that's a wild topic. That's the good one. And there's so much. But I'm just wondering, what are you, just before, okay, I'm sure everyone wants to talk about this too, so I have to be careful. But what do you think? What are like? How do you think it works? You did a good summation of what everyone thinks, or not only that, but what are you doing with what are you working on now in your life? Like, how are you putting this? How do you think we all can work with this? Like, what this third revolution and this new 22nd century coming up, how do you see this all working? Like, how do we get involved in your thinking? What's important?
So how to make it practical, right?
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I mean, that's the hard part. And I'm struggling like everybody. As I mentioned early on, I think most of us realize we're between enlightenment and catastrophe, and we don't really know what's going to happen first. And what can each of us do to try to hedge the bets for enlightenment? But I think, I honestly believe that getting our mythology right is part of that. Oddly enough, a friend dropped off in my mailbox just yesterday an article in the Sun by a woman named Eileen Christ. Let me just read part of it. It starts off talking about why we're so slow in responding to climate change. And the gist of it is that climate change is the symptom of a much greater problem. And what is the greater problem? She says the cause of our inaction is human supremacy, a largely unconscious belief that Homo sapiens are the masters of creation rather than just one humble species among millions. This worldview sanctions not only factory farming, clear-cut logging, mountaintop removal, and bottom trawl fishing, but also more commonplace behaviors such as cruising along in cars that slaughter wildlife and emit carbon dioxide. As long as human supremacy prevails, humanity will remain unable to muster the will to scale down and pull back. And so you might have seen some flavor of some references to Native America here. Native American spirituality has appealed to me over the years because it sees the human as an important part in the fabric of life, the web of life, but just one part. And every creature has its place. So I'm not really answering your question. I think each of us needs to find a niche where we can plug in. And for me, that's been climate change. I'm trying to raise awareness for that. But the bottom line is our mythology has to change away from Earth-centeredness to planet-centered. And you guys are all trying to do that. Each of us has to find our niche. I mean, I'd like to hear what you all have to say, because I feel as frustrated and as helpless at times as I think probably many of you do.
I have a question. Like all of the scientific concepts that you talked about, like especially with quantum physics, if you were to talk about it to someone that has never heard about this, that would be like their first time hearing about the being an observer and wave and particles, like how have you come about to discuss it and explain this new way of understanding reality?
Well, I've been very, very fortunate in the sense that I've been able to launch this in an honors class in the university. And so, first of all, they're very bright students. And secondly, we have time to build this up over a semester. So I have the benefit of developing a relationship with these students and building this gradually. But what I've also observed from this is that it's powerful. It's really powerful. And it really, it does change lives. A new way of looking at the world. And I lost my train of thought there, but the problem is, how does one spread this into a wider community? I mean, it's one thing for honor students to understand this. It's another for the average person on the street who's struggling to make ends meet. How do we democratize the message?
I think one way is what we're doing right now, which is, having people join us in conversation and teaching, presenting this to people who may have an interest, but who aren't familiar. I think that's where it starts and then ripples out, For one thing, I think that the ancient sages all would concur with the observer effect, right? And the fact that everything is connected, which is what quantum physics is demonstrating. And so you can approach it from the scientific angle. You can also approach it for someone who doesn't know anything about the science from a spiritual angle, and just show how science is substantiating it. That's.
I agree. Gloria and I have had many conversations along this line, and I'm both a scientist and a mystic, and I'm leaning way more toward the mystical side these days than I am the science side. So it sounds more legitimate in some cases to talk about the science of consciousness, but science is still struggling with what it is. And I think that there is a rationality behind, I know it sounds paradoxical, but there's a rationale behind the mystical in that everything improves when we become better lovers. And if we love as best we can in every place that we can at every opportunity, then all of the parameters improve. So I think to expand our capacity for loving and our capacity for experiencing love probably lies at the foundation of whatever paradigmatic change we want to make.
Yeah, I would agree, and that's the hard thing, because so much of what is happening right now is just devastating. And I think one problem that enlightened people have it's judgmentalism of those who aren't enlightened. So the question is, how can we become those loving beings that you're talking about? And non-judgmental.
I think that anyone who has truly had an enlightenment experience is anything but judgmental. I guess maybe we're getting into semantics then, but it's just like when you read the accounts of people who have had near-death experiences, their capacity for love just grows exponentially out of that as a consequence of that experience. And that to me is an enlightenment experience, that you don't have to be near death, or you don't have to die to have it. You can have it in a profound meditative state. But that the experience of enlightenment is an experience of tremendous love, you know. And so I think that the people who say they're enlightened and who judge others who aren't, I would not consider very enlightened. You know, they're just opposites in my way of seeing things. But I think that, you know, the thing that you read is very interesting, and in that the idea of humans being superior to all the rest of nature, as if we weren't part of nature, as if there's nature and then there's humanity, is something that stems, I think, from the Bible, where, you know, it said that we were in charge, so to speak, you know, that we, I forget the exact wording, but we're stewards of the earth, right? And that gave us a false idea, which is probably responsible for so many of the factors in climate change. I agree with that, and I hadn't really thought about it that way before.
I a week ago, I participated in a wonderful online conference called on this book, Is Consciousness Primary? And I forget who the speaker was, but one speaker mentioned a quotation from someone else that materialism is colonialism in drag. And the idea being, when I thought about it, I mean, materialism is the basis of colonialism, and it's the basis also of our sort of run-amok capitalism. Because in materialism, everything is a commodity rather than everything. Everything is an it rather than a thou. And Paul, I think what you were saying is that everything must be a thou if we're really going to transform ourselves and society.
Well, you know, first of all, let me say I read a lot, and your book is in my top 5 for this year. It was exceptionally well written. I loved it. It was a very enjoyable read. And I love the historical perspective. You put so much nuance into that I really, really got a lot out of it. So first of all, thank you for that. Second of all, to address Joanne's question, I don't think that we have to, you know, quantum mechanics is misquoted and misused so badly that, you know, your interpretation is totally correct. I'm not criticizing it, but so many people misinterpret it or overgeneralize it. I think it's far better, if we're going to hark to something, to do the current research at the University of Virginia, which is closer to your backyard, at the Perception Lab, where they've been doing all kinds of really good experimental design, showing that that consciousness survives the brain, and it's verifiable. It doesn't require. I mean, they've been investigated so tightly that their results are rather indisputable. I know, you know, you can't prove anything; you can only falsify, but they have some pretty astounding results. So I think to point to those, if people want scientific justification, is probably one of the more powerful resources we can use.
And go on.
Go ahead, Deb.
Well, I just, you know, in response to Joanne's question as well, I thought you summarized, there was a point in the presentation where you summarized it so well and so beautifully on just saying that, okay, we figured that there's not much in an atom. And then we figured there was, and we went on with the next 5 points, and then it's a wave or particle. I thought that was just a beautiful, simple way to summarize what, is really a lot of more in-depth stuff, but it was a nice way to kind of, reach that scientific footing, because it seems like as we move from materialism to this more awareness of the love and consciousness of the universe, it seems like people, if they have a few scientific facts to grasp onto, even if they're, paradoxical, that gives them something to, it gives them a starting point. And I do feel too that the part that I know of a lot, like Teilhard and Black Elk Speaks, that somehow that comes through in the teachings of what you're doing, and that groups like this is kind of like trying to get that energy field of this information out, and that love field out more. So this is, there is that forum, I want to say, like transmission or lineage associated with it. My question was, if you could expand on that, the creationist idea, you brought that through really well on bringing in the big time of evolution, and then saying, well, creation is happening now and in the future. And I just wanted to see if you could expand on that.
Well, I quoted Teilhard, but let's see if I can gather my thoughts again. This is about bedtime for me. maybe
All right.
for Jim too, but I'm sorry, I lost the train of thought. Ask me the question again. About.
I like the creation part that you said, where everything is being created now, and it was being created yesterday, and
right.
Tomorrow. And expand on that.
Sure. I mean, the Aristotelian view was that the universe is static, and then the biblical view of creation was everything is created in its current form by divine fiat. And by the way, 50% of Americans to this day will respond positively to this statement. Human beings were created more or less in their present form within the last 10,000 years. 50% of Americans believe that, and have believed that for about the last 50 years or so. But what these both revolutions have told us, is, first of all, the physical universe is not static, and the biological universe is not static. So if they're not static, then there's a creative element at every moment. And not only that, but we're present in that moment. So our individual and collective creativity participates or contributes to this whole creative stream that's evolving in a way. And in my honors class, you can even talk about this in strange ways. I mean, recently, there's been, gravity waves have been hypothesized for a long time, but they've only been measured within the last, 5 years, I think. And so I used to tell my students that, when you walk back to your class, you're actually rippling little gravity waves out through the cosmos. And I sort of used to say that in jest, but the truth is they're not very big waves. But so we each of us has an individual effect in what is happening. and then we have a much bigger collective effect. We wouldn't have that if this was a static, a static universe, but it's an evolving universe.
The idea of the butterfly flapping its wings in Japan
Right.
had an effect.
So, I mean, even those tiny little gravitational ripples that we send because of the butterfly effect can be amplified in a way to have a consequence that's far bigger than we might think. And it's interesting when I mean, there in my honors classes, there's some things, I have students keep journals, and there's some things that come through loud and clear. The first is these students have very few mentors, few adults that they can really look up to, because so many adults are so materialistic. And the students at this age want to make a difference. The second thing is they don't feel like they can make a difference because they feel too powerless. And many of us share that. So just little things like, yeah, you're actually as you're going back to the dining hall or your dorm, just remember you're rippling gravity waves out to the cosmos. I mean, little things like that.
Dr. Pruett, I have a question. Could you define the particle in reference to the wave? The concept of... Go ahead.
Yeah, Nancy, call me Dave, okay?
Dave.
Yeah. So physicists study both waves and particles. A particle is thought of as being having a very precise location in space, occupying only a point, let's say. And waves are distributed. Think of water waves, sound waves.
So the particle would be static and the wave is movement.
Well, a particle can move too, but
Okay.
waves and particles can both move.
All right. Thank you.
But the difference is two waves can be in the same place at the same time. I mean, if you're at the beach and there's one slow moving wave and a bigger one coming behind it, then they blend. They blend. Yeah. Okay.
And the particle bounces.
Yeah, exactly.
Does it? I get it. Thank you very much.
Yeah, exactly.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
If there are no more questions, I think we need to stop, and I really don't want to.
I just want to say a thing or two.
Yeah.
I share some thoughts that I have, but only if there's time and if it's okay. I've just been working on them. So I wrote some things down. I'm going to share some thoughts that I have. And that is, and I'm going to call this thing called the creation, this great reality. And it's hard for us to take it in because it's unfathomable. And for two, to know it, we have to kind of go beyond our mind to experience it from a deeper place. The mind is a nice, what I call an incredible, wonderful second place way of knowing. It's not the real knowing, but it's so yummy to be in our minds and to think. But there's a whole nother way to experience this. And another thing that I think is that reality requires responsibility. And we can only be responsible to what we understand. And without understanding or knowledge, we don't really know what we're doing. And then on top of that, if we could directly know something about reality, we would really be able to know that through knowing ourselves and knowing our own possibilities, which is beyond what commonly is understood. But even to know what's possible in a greater way, to know what's possible for us, we'd have to actually be willing to take responsibility for that. And that's not convenient, because that makes us like, we really, we become part of this thing much greater than us, and our personal comforts aren't really important. And so who's willing to do that? Who's willing to really go deeper into what, like a whole nother way of knowing things? And that's what I think this whole thing is about, is what's real on the deepest level. And so that's just a great work. And the last thing I want to say is that I think it's important that we have good leadership, because I don't think it's real that everyone's going to wake up. I think, Gurdjieff talked about a lot of people's lives. It's just compost for the moon. It's just organic life, just doing whatever it does. And it's not, I don't think, necessary that everyone wakes up, but some people do. But I think we need good leadership, because I think the founding fathers of this country and also all over the world, like, they were spiritual people, and they try to create a society in which we didn't destroy ourselves, and those values seem to have gotten lost. And so part of the problem right now is that there's no leadership that helps us save ourselves from ourselves. Thank you. That's just all I got right now.
Thank you, Lee.
Before we stop, I'd like to make two little announcements. One is, Deb, I see your name on the thing as Deb Beamer, but Deb is also known as Deborah Overberg, and she's going to be giving a presentation this coming Wednesday on 3 types of light and how they can be used in healing, in advanced practice, and also in healing the political divide. And I'm very much looking forward to that. So if you haven't registered yet, it's going to be a great presentation, I think. And also, Dave, I was so happy to hear that of your prioritizing climate change as most important issue that we need to deal with, most urgent, I would say, also. And sometime after the holidays, I'm going to start putting together a panel to discuss climate change. And I hope that I'll be sending you an invitation, and I hope that you will consider joining us on the panel. I'd love to have your input on that, and it should be really interesting. So I want to thank you, Dave. It was really enlightening and fun to listen to your material. I encourage everyone to read the book, because there's a lot more from where that came from. And the book is Reason and Wonder, and it really is an excellent book. So thank you so much, Dave, for
you, Dave,
sharing your time with us. And
it's a pleasure, you all.
Thanks so much, Dave.
Keeps me
I just ask you,
keeps me occupied during the pandemic.
Yeah. Thank you.
can I just ask, what's the human molecule? You mentioned it as a...
Oh, that was one of Teilhard's terms. And of course, he uses lots of terms that where the meaning is sometimes obscure. I just think he means a human being.
Okay.
Yeah.
okay.
Thank you all.
thank you.
Thank you.